I'd like to now change gears because we've talked about a lot of things that are negative, but let's look at some of the things maybe are positive, because there are positive disruptions that are coming about. So we have three speakers. We have Ken Jackson, who's going to talk to us about VeriGrain's sampling method, which is a way of determining what the quality of the grain is. And I mean, I can recall some 25 years ago, Dr. Bouchard was trying to search for the black box to do this, and it looks like now maybe we have something. Chris Bunio will be talking about TheoryMesh, looking at blockchain, moving things forward, and then finally we'll have Adil, Cubukgil, and Vince Uzumeri, if I haven't destroyed your name, talking about containerization and a new way forward in terms of that supply chain. So we're going to start with Ken Jackson. He is the CEO of VeriGrain Sampling Inc. His roots are in agriculture and engineering. He's been an entrepreneur for over 40 years. His focus has been on developing and commercializing leading edge technologies, and he's taken over 50 products to conception to commercialization, many of which have become market leaders. That's a really important record. His latest venture, VeriGrain, solves a major problem in the food chain, which will result from grain utilization and better value being maximized, easier traceability, and ultimately more and better food getting to the field to the table. So this is one of those positive disruptions. And Ken, I'm looking forward to hearing more about it.
Great. Well, I'm pleased to be part of this, and yeah, with all the sort of not so great stuff, or as my cousin would say, non-optimal things going on in the world. VeriGrain has been a very exciting project for me. Again, I come off a large seed farm in the middle of Saskatchewan, and I knew very early I didn't have the heart or the stomach to be a farmer. So I've been developing products to help farmers make more of what they've got for the last few decades, as well as being involved in some other industries. But farming has always been pretty close to my heart, and still there's still a family farm out there. So let me fire up my presentation here, and we'll get some, so you can have something to look at as opposed to just me. There we go. Okay. So just a little background on VeriGrain. We've technically been around for about 2.5 years. The VeriGrain really grew out of a project that I started about 15 years ago, around the time the next generation of sort of wireless grain bin and web-based grain bin monitoring was happening, and we were on the forefront of that and spun that technology off. But the roots of what's become VeriGrain started then, and very simply, it occurred to me that the only advance I had seen in sort of grain sampling and about in my lifetime to that point was we had graduated from a soup can on a cut off broken hockey stick to a plastic scoop. But fundamentally, it was the problem still all existed. So fast forward 13 or I guess 15 or so years now, VeriGrain has launched a product earlier this year, and we were quite honored to be selected for a couple of pretty substantial awards, both the AE50 award and then the Davidson Prize, which is actually the top 3 of the AE50. So we're this little Saskatoon-based company, and I got to share the stage with John Deere and AGCO. So it was quite an honor, but I think too it's really indicative that we've hit on something that's pretty important. And I would also mention that the thing I've seen with as I sort of look at the industry as a whole, is that there's been so much emphasis placed on growing more. and not nearly enough emphasis placed on making, ensuring that what's been grown is optimally utilized. And that's, if you sort of look at that end of the spectrum, there's actually, there's a lot more we could be doing with what we've got, and that value could be realized by both the growers and the processors and all the way up the food chain. So I'm going to sort of use that as a bit of a launch to go into my presentation here. So the problem that exists is that most growers don't get relatively poor samples or non-representative samples. The analysis then can't be accurate. There's no digital record associated. Moisture and temperature for the most part is unknown, or it's very hit and miss. So the opportunity for spoilage is there, and upwards of 90% of storage is not monitored. So to use a stat from actually MNP, they did some research. Actually, this is probably 3 years ago now, and came back with the sort of conclusion that your average grower doesn't know within 10% the quantity of what they've got stored on the farm. And in our experience, from a sort of quality perspective, they know even less about the quality. And there's really pretty limited or no data related to that grain that's available. So it's a when you put it in those terms, it's a pretty significant number that's almost a little bit unbelievable, actually. So the result is that growers are getting suboptimal utilization or lower prices for their grain. They're still incurring spoilage losses. One of our growers just a couple of weeks ago was talking to him, and he said he put a auger into a canola bin, and he knew right away that he had lost. And unfortunately he was able to blend it off, but it was still, he estimated $7,000 just on that one, a relatively small bin. So it's spoilage losses are an issue. From a buyer and processor perspective, if they're not getting delivered what they expected, they're incurring, they've got inefficiencies to deal with, and they're incurring additional costs. And it's especially an issue with processors, where they're trying to run a process, and to efficiently operate, you need to know what are you getting, so that what comes in can be turned into what's supposed to go out, and it all works. But it's today that is a challenge every day for those guys. And then from a data perspective, we have this increasing requirement for things like traceability and carbon sustainability, blockchain. Now the new one I'm hearing is regenerative agriculture. For all of those things to be meaningfully done or effectively done, you've got to have good data to make your decisions on. So this, one of the sort of mantras around here is that knowledge really is profit, and I realize I'm sort of taking that a bit of a spin on knowledge is power, but this from a grower perspective, knowing exactly what's in your bins can make you literally another $100 an acre. And quite frankly, it is the highest return on investment on your farm, and totally within your control. So now to clarify that too, I mean, that's a pretty bold statement, and no, you're not going to make $100 on every acre, but there's certainly some opportunity to, even if you can apply that to 10 or 20 or 30% of your farm, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, for an average grower. So, and sort of some, I cut 2 or 3 examples here. Again, just looking at the spreads on wheat. So number 1 and number 2, there's a little bit of a spread there. And then if you go from, a 2 to a 3, you've got about $14 an acre. But the difference between a 2 and feed is $110. And all it takes to turn number 2 into feed is a little bit of heat. So, that's the reality out there, the opportunity. So again, lentils, again, some significant spread there, especially when you get between a a 2 and an X3 or a 2 to a 3. Again, we're looking at 60 up to $120 an acre. Same thing with red lentils, and so on, and same thing with peas. So like I said, we're not suggesting that you're going to make it on every acre, but the opportunity is there if you know what you have. And there's examples that I could get into with, I think if a lot of people probably remember, what was it, last year, if you had a falling number over 300, you had some pretty valuable wheat. So but you have to know that, and I'll get into a little more detail there. But again, so this whole issue with growers of know what you've got, and I mean really get what you deserve. You put all this risk and effort and capital into growing the grain, why wouldn't you want the most for it? And from a buyer perspective, it's it really comes down to accurate samples and assured delivery. So there the emerging theme here is knowing your quality and quantity and getting those good samples. So starting with getting a representative sample, and of course the challenge there is that you can't sort of get a 5-gallon pail of sample for a 50,000 bushel bin. It's not going to be representative. The variation in across the field, you could have multiple fields going into a bin. So the process of sampling again hasn't changed much in sort of 40 years, and that the biggest complaint that we hear from growers with regard to sampling is that with labor being as challenging as it is these days, and even if it amounts to, you've recruited dad to drive the truck, or your teenage son is driving the truck in the fall, getting them to get a sample when there's all the other things going on. And I've had harvest referred to as a time of chaos. And so yes, it's like for a lot of people, and a lot of the time it's just, let's just get it in the bin. But if you don't get those samples as it goes in the bin, and especially if you're not doing it on a kind of call it a controlled basis, to where you do end up with a representative sample, and sticking the scoop in the door afterwards doesn't work. So that's the challenge that exists. And every grain buyer I've talked to says they do not trust what they're getting for samples. They know that often they are not representative. So again, you've got a system that's built on distrust of samples. So if you've got a representative sample, then conversely, yes, you can get an accurate analysis, as opposed to if your sample's not representative, then the analysis will may not be accurate. And then of course the third thing in this day and age, digital is such an important component of what's going on, and so that's a key part as well. So now the next thing, of course, is make sure it doesn't degrade. So even let's say you've got a representative sample, you've got an accurate analysis, and you missed a little bit of warm wet grain going in the bin, and now you've got 300 bushels of warm wet grain has just turned 3,000 bushels into into feed or garbage. So it's crucial to being able to check that moisture and temperature going into the bin, and more now as well, we're seeing traceability is becoming not just a request but a requirement to get those premium prices on grain. So providing this dirt to delivery traceability and even beyond delivery is quite crucial. So this is why VeriGrain is so important, or what we're doing is so important. From a grower perspective, we're helping them optimize and increase revenue. With buyers, it's about reduced cost, which ultimately translate to additional profit. And then the final beneficiary of all this, of course, is the consumer that's getting more and better food, and and I guess I would maybe throw on top of that, if you've got more food and it's better and you can get it cheaper, then it is a huge win. And all of this is supported by data that's crucial for not only transacting, but also for being able to provide performance feedback on inputs. And so as to what's been put on the crop is actually had a given result, or a measurable result. So it's really it is a triple win, with the growers getting better samples, better knowledge, better price. They're delivering what they sell, and they can provide traceability. They're also with buyers, again, mostly about decreased costs, but also a much more efficient customer interaction, because you've got a digital record. The samples are representative, and there's a greater trust factor, and a more efficient sort of sample handling can happen. They're getting what they purchase, so they're realizing more increased operational efficiency and throughput. And again, as ultimately consumers start getting that more and better food. So what makes VeriGrain really unique is that we are able to provide the most accurate and real-time on-farm stored grain quality and quantity information. And the way we're able to make that claim is that we are the only guys, they're the only product company that is actually interacting with the grain through the sample acquisition and the data management as the grain is loaded into and out of storage, right? So there's lots of software out there which tracks quality and quantity, so inventory, but it's all based on manual input, which can be either lag, or it's obviously subject to error, and so by sort of getting involved right at the point of where the grain is going in the storage and collecting that data, that's where VeriGrain is able to really add some significant quality of data into the system. And because we're creating this digital record immediately, it can be shared immediately to both with the grower and even with the buyer, to start making sort of decisions as to how to optimize, how to maximize the value of that grain. So if you look at the sort of the world according to VeriGrain and what we do, and it's really about creating this grower to buyer information bridge, and starting with transparency of information and followed by with trust and ultimately traceability. So the process starts with getting creating a digital record as the grain's being loaded into storage, getting that representative sample and managing it properly, then followed up by hopefully accurate analysis. You then have this intelligence to make better decisions about inventory management and selling, finding optimal or maximum prices, and then delivering to specification. The other thing that's really quite important about what VeriGrain is doing is that we're creating this unique data set, which has got this very accurate, very real-time information for grain quality and quantity. So there's a lot of other pieces of software or applications that where that data becomes of great value. So again, we mentioned earlier, inventory management software can use it, but when you start thinking about grain marketing and having better more immediate, more accurate quality and quantity information, the things like traceability, sustainability, carbon, even crop insurance and lenders, so there's just a lot of other applications for the data that are quite valuable. So the ultimately what VeriGrain is doing, what our goal is to provide this total inventory intelligence picture, which includes the quality and quantity aspects, obviously tracing, the connection back to production and transport. And I won't sort of go around the circle here, but ultimately at the bottom, it's about creating, value for the grower and the buyer, and also providing that data, which is increasing, becoming increasingly important. So, look, I hope everyone's excited about what we do. Here's how we do it. These are the pieces of VeriGrain. So again, it all starts with an app. Of course, it's in this day and age, everything is being done on a smartphone, it was an amazing tool that even 10 years ago, when, again, as Barry mentioned, I've been involved with a lot of product development. Since when the introduction of the smartphone has totally changed the way we approach product development, because of the versatility and communication capabilities. All those things have just changed the way products are developed. So there's the app. There's different versions that interact, whether you're an enterprise user, so like a buyer or a processor, or a grower. It does sample management. I'll come up to another bit here, or piece here, that I'll bring up another item that the phone does, but and the other thing too that was we sort of learned the hard way is it has to function completely offline, and have no ability to connect, because until Elon Musk has got the world surrounded with satellites, we are going to have a lack of or dead spots in connectivity on the farm. So that's also a key element of or a development piece that we had to figure out. So from a sample acquisition perspective, we've got a few different ways to do it that start with, as simple as a next generation scoop on a stick. And we, one thing we have done with just, sort of the most sort of minimal update to the scoop on a stick is on, if you can see in the picture there, there's a slotted sort of sample acquisition tool. And the reason for that is that, very simply, when you go to take a sample using a scoop on a stick, the grain flow coming out of a truck, has the dockage, the lighter stuff tends to be concentrated on the edges. So as you take that scoop into the flow, it fills up immediately with and it's non-representative. So if you're sort of go in upside down and flip it, I mean, there's ways to get around that, but again, back to my earlier comment, harvest is chaos, there's no time. So we've created a tool that makes it easier to get a more representative, a cross-cut sample. So that's the kind of the entry level. We've also created a tool on the smartphone so your phone beeps and vibrates when it's time to take a sample. We actually have some intellectual property around the calculation to determine the optimal sampling interval to ensure that your 3-gallon pail of sample actually represents 5,000 or 10,000 or whatever bushels of grain. So your phone beeps and vibrates every time it's time to take a sample based on the flow rate of the handling system. So the next step up from that is actually the product that's shown on the screen with the yellow handle, and that is we would call our smart sampler, and it Bluetooth connects to the smartphone, and has a strobe light on it, so it strobes when it's time to take a sample. And again, it just provides a visual indication of what that it's time to take a sample. So that's kind of the first toes in the water in terms of how do we improve sample manual sample acquisition. And then we've taken that up a further notch to what we're calling the ultra sampler, and it's fully automated. It goes on your auger. There's in addition to the ultra sampler, we have the unit up in the top right-hand corner there that actually goes on the discharge of an auger. So we've got a couple of different approaches to how we can take samples, but it's all microprocessor controlled and Bluetooth connected to the phone. So you just set up the sample and push the button and walk away. And when the bucket's full, you get an email, it's time to change the bucket, and away you go. And so it really sort of gets gives the grower a very hands-off approach to getting samples, and you get perfectly representative samples because it's all microprocessor controlled. So the other piece that we are adding to that this year is real-time moisture and temperature. So every time one of these representative samples is taken, we're measuring moisture and temperature. So now we're able to provide an indication or track the grain as it goes into the bin with some pretty high degree of granularity, so that the 300 bushels of warm wet grain doesn't turn into a 3,000 bushel loss. So that's one of the things we're doing. We're also planning on testing later this year a real-time characteristics determination. So again, you can see as the grain is going into the bin, what's the protein, what's the starch, what are those sort of relevant characteristics that you want to know. So, and I really do believe that ultimately that is the future of sort of grain characteristics, and the if you sort of put on your blue sky thinking hat for a moment, and look at the way technology has gone. I think it's not too hard to connect the dots to see that if the technology is once it is trusted and proven for doing real-time characteristics on the farm, the need for sending samples in is going to certainly lessen and maybe ultimately disappear altogether. I don't know if that'll be in my working lifetime or not, but so that's sort of the sampling side of it. We've also done a couple of things to ensure, well, first of all, to really simplify sample tracking, we have these proprietary barcoded bags and sample containers. So it's the phone, when you're creating a sample, you just scan the barcode on the phone, and it now allows you to track the sample very readily. We also created a developed product called a mixer splitter. Sample, even a representative sample container can have variation throughout it. So if you're wanting to split that sample down into subsamples so that everyone that's getting a sample has the same sample, you need to make sure that sample is mixed properly and then to get the identical subsample split. So we've created a product that makes that very quick and easy to do. We have a number of features or related features on the app, which make it very easy to add the characteristics to the sample record from your on-farm instruments, if you have them. If you want to send the samples off to a lab, we have a thing called a lab portal, which connects to all of the major labs in Canada. So you can, with the click of a couple of buttons, order whatever kind of a lab test you want, and that data will come right back onto your sample record. You can also do that with your grain buyers. As I mentioned on the last slide, I think the future of all this is real-time analysis. There's the technology, NIR-based and even visual-based technology is quite well advanced now, so that it is possible to get very accurate analysis in the field. But you've got to start with a representative sample, and you have to get enough of, analyze enough of the grain to be able to determine, okay, overall, what does this look like? Because there's going to be variations, and so there is some data management here that's got to be done. So, and ultimately that rolls into this whole inventory intelligence piece, which is being able to search and sort through what you have to see, okay, well, what have I got? How can I combine it? Who would be, the best company to, buyer for this. Now, one thing I want to clarify is that we don't get involved in the value side of things. We just provide the quality and quantity information, so that there's lots of companies, that can take that data and do the, that marketing and value component, and that's, we're partnering with those companies to allow them to do that. A related tool that we've also developed is what we call our digital bin board, and I think a lot of you, or many of you, can relate to the big whiteboard with the circles on it that seems to be pretty common at a lot of farms. And that's the way, that, and maybe in an Excel sheet, or there is some some apps and now that are helping to manage inventory. But what we wanted to do is replace that whiteboard with a digital version that you have on your phone, that allows you to very, very easily visualize and manage all of the grain. We've also created barcode labels that can go on the bin, so you can avoid or totally eliminate the problem of the grain being taken from the wrong third bin from the end, or loaded into that bin. So there's, it's a relatively simple tool, but it's meant to make life easier and your inventory easier to manage. Probably some familiar faces there. I won't bother going through one by one, but we've got a terrific team behind us that have got some people with some pretty deep roots in the agriculture sector. And I'm going to stop there because that's getting into my business deck, which we don't need to bother with. So that's I'll stop sharing, and if there's any questions, I would be happy to answer.
Well, thank you very much, Ken. I don't see any questions that come in through the chat, but maybe what we should do, if it's okay with you, is to move on.
Yep.
Let's hear all three, and then we get the panel at the end, which because I'm sure a lot of these questions will be cross cutting as well. So our next speaker is Chris Bunio, and he's the co-founder and CEO of TheoryMesh, a Winnipeg-based company focused on agriculture and food supply chains. Chris operationalized TheoryMesh in 2021 with a focus on developing technology for traceability solutions, leveraging blockchain and machine learning. Chris represents TheoryMesh as a founding member of the IEEE Blockchain and Agriculture Working Group. So, Chris, over to you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Barry. Happy to be here today. Great session so far. I've tuned in for most of the day, so it's great to hear about everything that's happening in the space and around, the Canadian grain and transport industry. A little bit of background on myself. Barry did a great intro there, but to fill out the picture a little bit more, born in Flin Flon, so fairly remote in Manitoba, but spent most of my time in Winnipeg. Went to U of M for physics, so I'm not from an ag background. I'm from a science and technology background. I spent about 18 years at Microsoft doing global strategy, technology, business development before coming back to Winnipeg during the pandemic and operationalized TheoryMesh. And to give you a little bit of a sense of what we're trying to do at TheoryMesh, we're really trying to bring the agriculture and food supply chain together. I know that we think about food as a consumer product, and when you buy something in the store, if you don't sort of understand what's happening behind the scenes, you kind of see the package and see the labels, and that's sort of your view of what's happening with food. But as everyone on this call knows, it's a little bit more complex than that. There's a lot of gaps in this process, and really these all operate as little independent silos as we look at the food system. When we sort of think about the origin story for TheoryMesh, it was a way for me to bring together a focus on technology. So I was in software development before joining Microsoft, but I've always been passionate about technology, along with the fact that I actually have a gluten allergy. And an interesting thing about gluten in North America, it is in many, many, many foods, more than you'd kind of expect based on thinking about what's made out of wheat. But gluten finds its way into so many different things. And as you start sort of digging through the supply chains and trying to understand what's actually a safe food product, what you run into very quickly is it's very difficult to get the information across that supply chain to be able to understand food production. So it's an interesting starting point from our journey with TheoryMesh, but the bigger thing that we've stumbled into is that that same question of what's happening across the supply chain has many other implications as well. So food waste, traceability, food safety, sustainability, those are all different sides of the same die. So you have all of those different areas that are answered by the same solution, which is really increasing that traceability across the food supply chain. So I love going after Ken. The work that VeriGrain's doing is awesome, and we will be looking forward to partnering with them in the future. So that's a thing I'll talk to Ken about offline. But what we've seen in agriculture production in general is there's an explosion of farm and food data that's coming through from new technology. So when we think about all of the information that's captured on the field today, any farmer that has a John Deere tractor is generating millions and billions of data points continuously through the use of that machine. And the same thing applies across all these different areas. And the technology is increasing, not decreasing. So if we look at new biological field applications, if we look at different farm management tools, sensors, new ways of using satellite imagery, the amount of information at that field level is just increasing and increasing all the time. One thing that has not changed is that very little of that information actually flows through the supply chain. So if you're producing wheat today, and even if you're using, a farm management tool or some sort of data collection tool for the farm, very little of anything that you capture at that farm level is going to flow through the rest of the supply chain. And you'll ask the question, why is that important? Well, as we start to see traceability and sustainability becoming bigger and bigger topics, particularly right now in the US and the EU, that's obviously going to be something that gets driven by data as we keep on going forward. So there's definitely going to be a need to be able to have more of that producer data coming into the supply chain. But it's the same thing on the processor side. So if you're a food processor today, typically you'll run some systems that capture some data as you're manufacturing your product, but you'd be stunned at the amount of paper, maybe you wouldn't be, stunned by the amount of paper that still exists in those systems. So if you're a food processor and you have to process a recall, you're basically digging through binders, spreadsheets, and maybe an ERP system to go find that information. So it's very difficult to find all those different pieces that you need to be able to process a recall. But even in a simpler case where you want to reduce food waste or maybe create a new product, being able to dig through the data that you have on your food production, your sourcing, your ingredients, the quality of those ingredients, that is a difficult challenge. So we're seeing the need to be able to digitize more of that information. And then ultimately consumers drive a lot of the buying behavior and a lot of the moves in the food industry. So we're seeing, the demand for things like organic, gluten-free, those different areas are certainly robust in terms of demand, but we're also seeing new demands around sustainability and more we're going to see traceability. So going from the farm to the consumer, we see that sort of certification, traceability, and sustainability driving a lot of the demand. And the flip side of that is once you have that data across your supply chain, you can do more optimization. You can be better able to respond on food safety. And one of the things that's very interesting in the world right now is what's happening from a regulatory perspective. So if we look at the US, the FDA in the US just launched their traceability rules in November, which are going to require maybe it was December, require food companies to have information across their supply chain for basically every step in their processing and to be able to make that available in an electronic format. Today it starts with a few areas like leafy greens and seafood and a few other food products, but it will extend to general food production. So that definitely is going to drive the need for digital solutions. The other area is on sustainability. So the SEC in the US is finalizing their sustainability reporting, but this is a place where Europe is already far ahead. Europe has had a sustainability rule on the books for a little while now, but they've just expanded that to include deforestation. So there's in 18 to 24 months, companies selling products into the EU are going to have to be able to prove that there was no deforestation on land in their supply chain. So that's going to become another place where data is going to be needed to just be able to sell products. So the whole need for data across the supply chain is going to continue, and we're going to see that that increasing as we go. For TheoryMesh, which is my company, started to really track this whole supply chain. We really look at things across that supply chain. So we've got an app and application to be able to track data at the farm level. So we can do record keeping on production methods, technology like that. We're incorporating satellite imagery and more machine data, so reading from systems like John Deere tractors to be able to capture that sort of full crop picture. We connect that with food and beverage processors who are today direct sourcing. So they're going directly to those farms to be able to capture that information. But increasingly, we'll be able to go to aggregators and more of the commercial mainstream grain companies to be able to do that. But there we integrate and digitize paper and turn that all into nice digital records for use. I won't talk about machine learning today, but we use machine learning to help people optimize their processes as well. And then ultimately, we can get to the consumer with QR codes that can go on packages and really show them what's happening in their product and get that true seed to package traceability. So that's kind of the area and the place that we play. Underpinning all of this, we do use blockchain. It's a word that has lots of different meanings and connotations and perceptions depending on where you are. Hopefully no one got caught up in the FTX scandal, but there is definitely an interesting sort of perception of what it is. So when I talk about blockchain, one of the things that I would do if we were all in person together and live is I'd ask people to give me their thoughts on what blockchain is. And when I've done that in the past, this is kind of what I get is, a word cloud of a bunch of different stuff. And what you can see are things that are really truly about blockchain. So the digital data side of it, the internet driven is a big piece, nodes, ledgers, those things come up. But the topics that dominate the conversation are really cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. And just to get started, I'll say cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, those things are built on blockchain, but blockchain has got more applicability than just those two. So I'm not going to talk too much about Bitcoin and crypto. I will offline if you want to reach out and chat, but here I'm going to focus more kind of on the blockchain itself. So to go into a lightweight definition, because we could spend time diving into a lot of real technical detail, I'm just going to hit on a few high-level points. So the way to think about blockchain is it's a computer system which creates an immutable record of information. So it's essentially a digital ledger. And that's ledger from the accounting sense of I'm recording transactions in a single place. And in this case, those transactions are not changeable. So you can't go back and alter the data that's been put on the blockchain. It becomes a permanent record of what's happened. It's interesting because, as a technology, most technologies do allow for some sort of, fraudulent activity. You can change things, you can modify things, as we've seen in different industries. But with blockchain, it becomes an immutable record of that. So you can't go back and change what happened in the past. Typically, blockchain is distributed in multiple locations, and this is important because when we see the increasing number of natural disasters and things like that, what we're also seeing is that puts strain on our systems and how technology becomes part of that. So Ken was mentioning having offline access. One of the things from good computing system design is that you want to be able to have systems that are independent of location so that you don't get into an issue where a flood in Manitoba basically wipes out your ability to use your systems. So that distributed nature is really important. Blockchain is very much transaction based. So everything that happens on a blockchain is about a transaction of some sort. It's taking an action on information, transaction between people, could be any kind of transaction. And the one thing to understand about blockchain as well is that there are multiple different implementations of blockchain. So blockchain really, the term refers to a chain of blocks, where a block is a basic piece of information. But there are multiple different implementations of that that look at whether that information is public. So is everything shared with anybody who can access that blockchain? Is it private, only shared with those people who are granted access? And there are different use cases for different types of blockchains. So at a high level, those are big things to kind of keep in mind. The technical detail behind a lot of this goes into a lot of cryptography and other areas that are a little bit beyond what we'll talk about today. But certainly happy to talk about that if you are interested in the detail. So one of the things that definitely pops up all the time is, well, if blockchain is really about managing information, why is it different from Excel or a database? And in a lot of ways, what you do with blockchain or a spreadsheet or a database is manage information. And what we see with that, if we take a look at what everybody knows well, which is a spreadsheet, here are some of the characteristics of a spreadsheet. So it's local data, typically no transactions, no real history. And if you use macros, you have to have access to that spreadsheet to use it. So very much a local thing. You can have a couple people maybe share that, but there's no shared context for people at a bigger scale. When we go up and look at databases, Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server, you can have more users, you can share some data, you can create some transactions and have some history, and you've got some programming language that are generally a little bit proprietary. So this opens the door for more functionality, but it's still not quite at the level of being able to give everybody open access to information. So you're still putting constraints around what people can access and what they can do. With blockchain, technically, you've got the ability to have an unlimited number of people access that system. And I'm put a little asterisk there. That's very highly dependent on what blockchain you're using and how you've set it up and configured it, if it's a private blockchain. You've got some options on whether you want to have public data or create consortiums in a blockchain. So the cryptocurrencies are all public systems. So anybody who with an internet connection can access Bitcoin, for example, where something like IBM Food Trust is a private system or a consortium system, which is only accessible by those business partners in that group. A couple other things. So some of the more interesting areas that we're seeing come up, and I'll talk about one specific scenario of this. Third point from the bottom, tokens, and then the one right below that, smart contracts. Blockchain has introduced the idea of things that can stand alone and operate on their own. So the idea that you can have a software program that does stuff on its own when it's triggered by a certain type of action. And this is what gave rise to a lot of the cryptocurrencies. But it also lets us do interesting things around information. So we're seeing a lot of experiments with blockchain to do things like create tokenized assets, which means there's a digital representation of an asset like a bushel of wheat that's stored on the blockchain. And then in that case, you can interact with that in a digital way, while that may still represent a physical asset. So those are pretty early scenarios that we're seeing right now. We're involved in some pilots that are looking at livestock and tokenizing data for those livestock, but I think we'll see more and more scenarios like that come up over time. And that's one of those areas where that connection to currency directly in public blockchains is actually an interesting way to facilitate some of this. So today, if you have a cryptocurrency like Ethereum, you can use that to trade directly with other contracts on that blockchain. So if you, for example, wanted to buy a bushel of wheat using that specific system that was set up to tokenize those bushels of wheat, you'd be able to do that by using cryptocurrency. So today, some of those are pretty limited in use case, but as countries are starting to get more blockchain-based policy on their books, we'll see new scenarios open up and potentially new trading patterns open up as a result of that as well. So why blockchain in the supply chain? Well, these are the 5 things that kind of come up over and over again. So the first one, this idea of immutability. So you can't change the information that's there. We kind of think about this and don't necessarily think too deeply about this, but as we look at more around sustainability and some long-term impacts that we're going to see around information, that immutability of information is going to become more and more important. So we want to have records that exist and live beyond the life of the transaction, so that we know if carbon was sequestered, or we know what's happened. For a lot of products that we do produce, even when it comes to things like grain, you may have a harvest and have a crop in storage from one year that only gets processed the next year, and you don't want the information behind that to be transient. So you may want some permanence in terms of that actual product. Blockchains typically are multi-party, so you can have interaction directly between different parties within that blockchain, which opens the door for simplified ways of interacting. So instead of faxing a piece of paper from one partner to another, everybody can access that blockchain and have their part in the transaction. Smart contracts create that kind of independent action on the blockchain, so you can have programs that are written on blockchain that take action. So once a contract requirement has been fulfilled, it can go and move a process to the next step independently of the players, but it's still all trackable and traceable within that blockchain environment. Blockchains increasingly are having standard connections, so it's easier for enterprise software to connect to blockchain, as well as more companies developing direct tie-ins. So our company produces blockchain records that go on version of the Ethereum blockchain, but we can integrate with other blockchains as well. And then the last piece, that distributed nature, is important as we look at increasing frequency of natural disasters and being able to have information available in different places. So to make it a little bit more real, I'll just kind of take a very surface simple level supply chain here. So some suppliers providing some kind of good to manufacturing, which then is turned into a product, goes through distribution to a customer. So if we look at how this kind of functions with blockchain or through a typical scenario, we'd see that sourcing being done, documentation generated around what was purchased from a sourcing perspective. Increasingly, you'd have ESG data, you'd have maybe visual data, testing data. If we're working with VeriGrain, you might have some grain testing data that comes from that sourcing relationship. Into the manufacturing, you'll have work that gets done around that manufacturing process, product quality testing, all these different pieces, potentially now visual information that gets stored there as well. You'll want to look at contract compliance to make sure that everything has been done according to contracts with outsourced manufacturers or that sourcing relationship. Looking at the transport shipping manifest and making sure that you've got the right records going right through that process. And then ultimately, customers are going to want to have that PO fulfillment and payment process. Today, in a normal environment, this is at least 5 different systems. Some of these are still paper-based in a lot of cases. Others might be spreadsheet or ERP-based. But you still have a number of different systems that you're going to be interacting with to be able to get that. And if you did, as a customer, want to go and get traceability right back to that original source, that could be quite difficult. With blockchain, all those different partners would be interacting with one blockchain-based system. So all those different steps in the process that we showed below would be smart contracts or transactions on that blockchain, and each of the different players in that supply chain could interact with that information and those contracts. Now, obviously, we're talking kind of about a public scenario here, so everybody's got access to the information. You could have limited access for some of these players, but we'll just keep it a little bit simple. But this tracks, all the different steps in that process, as well as all the different interactions that people have with that information. So as you get the material coming from your supplier and you go through manufacturing, your customer could potentially be seeing that information early on. So if they wanted to validate testing on the incoming supply on blockchain, you could give them access to do that. If I, as a customer, said, I need to know that I've got sustainably sourced wheat, as an example, with blockchain, with tracking that whole production line, you could have that information available at each of those different steps in that process. So it opens the door for more collaborative business process while keeping that permanence and immutability on the data side as well. So a few things that we're seeing already in terms of blockchain and the supply chain, contract compliance processes. There's some great case studies of companies already using blockchain to help with this. One of the best ones is Walmart Canada, who was using blockchain to help deal with their suppliers, and they were able to digitize processes and reduce their payment time for some of the contracts substantially from days to, I think it was actually months, to down to hours or days. So some substantial compliance and contract process improvements that you can get. Speeding payment, again, we'll see this come up more and more as financial systems integrate with blockchain. We're seeing big banks in the US are all looking at ways to fulfill on blockchain-based transactions. Canadian banks are starting to evaluate this. So if we can have digital contracts that represent our physical real-world contracts, and that transacts through a bank with a blockchain-based transaction, that can move us from EFTs or SWIFT-based transactions right to instant payment on those contracts. One of the big things that we're seeing is definitely this idea of reducing risk. So having information as early as possible in the supply chain that tells you what your product is, what you're expecting, and how you're going to get it, helps customers at the end of the supply chain to understand a little bit more about that and prepare for it. And as I talked about early on, that traceability and transparency, whether that's because of a customer demand where customers want to see that more and more, or a company who wants to use that as differentiation, or the upcoming regulations in markets that we're already seeing land now, we see that as a huge factor for increasing that traceability and transparency through blockchain. So those are today's scenarios that we see already through those different industries. We're seeing additional things coming in the future. So there's a lot of exploration around country-based digital currencies, and we're seeing more and more information being able to be processed with machine learning on top of permanent data on blockchain. So we'll see increasing scenarios around blockchain and how that's going to function in the world. So I'll leave my contact details here. I'm certainly happy to talk with anyone at any time about blockchain. I do a lot of blockchain discussions and lectures, but also to talk about the supply chain and how we see the traceability and transparency pieces coming together at TheoryMesh, and where that kind of intersects with the concerns on this call around the overall supply chain.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. I can see that there's a theme going on here with traceability. Certainly have the collection of data and the transmission of data, and our next speakers are going to look at how do you keep the product with the data, and so the question of traceability and moving through the supply chain. So thank you very much. We'll come back to you at the end for some questions. So if you'll cease to share your screen, and I'll ask Adil and Vic to come forward with your presentation. I'm not sure how you're going to present together or apart, but I'll leave that to you guys to sort out. Adil Cubukgil is, well, actually, I guess you guys met at the University of Toronto many years ago, working in transportation and logistics, and sort of went your separate ways. I certainly remember working with Adil when he was with Vestac, and went off in consulting and other things. And Vic, we haven't had a chance to meet, but it's a pleasure to see you virtually here. So I will leave others to read your full bio on the website, and I'll, in the interest of time, let you get started.
Thank you, Barry, for that kind introduction. I'm going to speak about a common passion of ours going back many decades, containerization. Prairie Grain Portal is a portal with a mission to facilitate a paradigm shift in grain trades. Now, a bit of a background. Canada is among the top 10 grain producers in the world, and the 5th largest exporter. With little growth in domestic consumption, our export share is growing as yields continue to increase. We already export more than half of what we grow, but are highly captive to bulk systems. More than 85% of our grain export volumes are in bulk, less than 15% in containers. And that's where the problem lies. Our dependency on bulk trades, we never admit to it, limits our export proceeds as a nation. We sell wheat as if it was wheat. Sometimes we distinguish durum, but beyond that, we really don't know what's going on. But more than that, bulk trades squeezes the margins producers get at their farm gates. In essence, we do not get value commensurate with what we export. Our mission is to facilitate a shift away from bulk exports to direct sales, from producers to end users, shipped from production sources to processing facilities in containers. So what's wrong with bulk trades? Well, bulk systems are relics. I mean, for more than a century now, we've gotten into this habit that we cannot shed. We consolidate in country elevators. We transport by rail to coastal terminals. We ship in bulk vessels. And we impose the mirror image of this to the receiving end, to the importers. They need coastal terminals, and they have numerous layers of distribution systems until the grains that we supposedly sell are received by end users. Inherited from a bygone era, they're seen as the most efficient and least cost way of moving grains. But in today's intermodal era, containerization offers huge advantages that we shun aside or ignore, and this has been going on for decades now. And both Barry and I are very familiar with these debates. Nobody used to take us seriously. Now they listen to us, but still rather reluctantly. Bulk trading practices through large contracts suppress the export value we earn from global grain markets. And moreover, as I mentioned, squeeze producer margins at farm gates. We sell grains, but how do we sell them? I mean, in tens of thousands of lots, ton lots, and often over 100,000 ton lots. With grain trades becoming highly specialized by crop type, by class, by grade, we must wake up to the containerization imperative, driven by both cost and quality considerations. Now, let me look back about 50 years. I'm old enough to remember most of it, but not all of it. But we've had this institution called the Canadian Wheat Board, a monopsony that controlled all grain sales, domestic or export. And and this was established in 1935, became permanent in 1965 through successive extensions. And as of the 1970s into the trade liberalization era, we started cutting back on the Canadian Wheat Board's domain and limited it to wheat and barley. And initially it was more or less everything because wheat was our major export staple, a large chunk of our exports mixed in with a bit of barley. But then as we went down this trade liberalization path, we observed that grain trades across North America have become much more efficient. End users buying directly from farms, end users being flour millers or distillers, brewers, cereal companies, canola crushers, even feedlots. And these direct sales allowed both the buyers and the sellers to eliminate intermediaries, thereby reduce consolidation and distribution costs. And in general, maybe not perfectly, but we saw that there was a fair share or a fair split of sharing these cost savings between buyers and sellers. And if we look deeper into it, what made this possible across North America were direct deliveries by truck or rail car. There was no need for an intermediary to consolidate or to distribute. End users could procure what they needed directly from farms. Now we're living in an era where the same can be achieved to overseas export markets through containerized deliveries. As in across North America, overseas buyers can reach out to our production sources to procure a huge variety of high-value crops shipped directly to their doorsteps in containers. With advances in intermodal systems, fully allocated costs of container shipments have become lower than bulk systems. Not too many people will agree with us, but that has been the reality for years, if not decades now. And more than just cost savings, with the added advantages of crop quality preservation, whereby a lot of technologies can feed into containerized exports, like the two examples that we saw before us. Well, with all these obvious cost and quality advantages, why is containerization not taking place more rapidly? Why haven't we containerized all our exports, grain exports? Well, we're in denial, but this has happened in many parts of Asia. To give you one example, all the way from EU to Eastern Europe, across Eurasia, across Central Asia, all the way to Asia Pacific, our share of grain exports may be 85% bulk, but 80% of Asia, 85% or somewhat even more of Asia Pacific's imports from their west are containerized already. Obviously, we're not reinventing the wheel. I mean, earlier you saw presentations of Black Sea and so on. Most of Asia Pacific receive grains from their west in containers. Ships even are not even involved in the supply chain. Simply put, the lack of direct sales channels that we observe today holds us back from containerizing our exports. And what's the reason? It's not due to lack of containers or lack of container trains or lack of container ports, and the same at the receiving end. It really is lack of direct sales channels that we've never paid attention to cultivate. Maybe this is what we've inherited from the wheat board, Canadian Wheat Board, and now in the hands of an oligarchy, we call it, of grain companies. We overlook these realities. And we take our reputation on the global stage for granted, but the world knows very little about the virtues of our grain economy and the huge variety of crops that can be procured from primary sources. And if you don't take my word for it, just pretend you're a flour miller from Asia Pacific looking to import durum from Canada. Where would you go? I mean, if you went on the internet, you'd be lost in a maze of 20, 30, 40, 50 websites, and you still wouldn't know where to turn to buy durum from Canada. And this is the lack of direct sales channels that we're talking about. Now, our grain companies, our primary exporters, are highly invested in terminal costs, driven by a volume imperative to sell in large bulk contracts I mentioned earlier, tens of thousands, if not 100,000 plus contracts. They bid on in global grain markets. End users in overseas markets buy our grains through local distribution channels, not even aware the fact that they could buy directly from farms and consolidate the volumes they need. In fact, if you ask a flour miller, the example I gave earlier, where their durum was coming from, I mean, they're likely to tell you if it's China or Japan, it's coming from Kazakhstan, but they would know that even if we sold durum to Asia Pacific or to China, the largest durum market in the world, they would know that the durum that they're processing or milling is grown in Canada. And this is the information gap, talking about bulk trades and average market prices and this and that. We've lost reality of what exports trades should be all about. Now, we've been dabbling in this business for 20, 30 years, at least I have been. And before we went online with our portal, we wanted to test producer appetite for direct sales and whether they could see the benefits that they could gain from selling direct. And most industry observers, I guess the only people they hear from are the grain vested interest grain companies, said, "Oh, they'll never sell direct." Well, we wanted to validate our hypothesis that with a premium paid in cash at farm gates and the buyer taking over all the logistics responsibilities of transporting those grains to their own facilities, no farmer would object. And in fact, we spend a year verifying this concept, and we now have a following of 20, 25,000 people reading our articles, why we got into this business and the benefits of direct sales and so on. And it's not an issue worth talking about anymore. The problem is with the sellers selling Canada, with the buyers selling Canadian virtues to overseas buyers. Now, the next step in our strategy is the introduction of our new and much enhanced platform we call Prairie Grain Mall, a virtual marketplace to attract grain buyers from overseas markets. And with that, I'll hand it over to my old friend and colleague, Vic, who leads our development efforts in developing through various stages this new platform.
Okay.
Vic,
Okay.
I have the controls.
So skip to the next slide.
Sorry?
Skip to the first map slide, to the next
Okay.
one there. Okay, I might as well introduce myself. I'm Vic Uzumeri. I'm retired emeritus professor in operations management and supply chain at Auburn University, but I am Canadian. And I've simultaneously with having worked in supply chain for three or four decades, I've also had boutique software development companies where I did an awful lot of development with services that went international. So working with people delivering services in Germany and Asia and other locations. So this is sort of a synthesis of Adil's gotten the problem stated to the point of we've got the product, it's highly high quality and potentially highly differentiable. And if this were cocoa or coffee, for example, we'd be talking about getting your barley from Regina Mountain Estates. Well, maybe not. In any event, we'd be branding, and that's what those commodity industries are able to do. Now, that's a far reach. We're not going to get there, but that's a direction to think about the idea that Adil was describing. That's where our sort of horizon goal probably ought to be. If we have the quality and we have the consistency and we have the technology, really we should get the kind of margins that go with being recognized for that. So what we have right now, as he said, is commodity and spot sales are well covered. If you go to the next slide, the challenge is to augment or expand a system where individual farmers or small groups of farmers or supply consortiums or whatever with defined brands work with overseas customers who want to buy that defined brand and use the existing supply chain, containerized supply chain, to make that happen. The problem, clearly, is that the overseas potential buyers don't know that the brands exist and don't know how to find them or how to get the stuff delivered. So it's an information problem. This is actually, if go back to VeriGrain and to TechMesh, this is a problem that occurs in advance of the problems they solve. If we could figure out how to get the overseas suppliers, or overseas buyers, to recognize and value it, then all of the tools that were just presented would be a godsend. So if we want to switch to the next slide, we want to try to create online trade facilitation. And if we switch to the slide beyond that, it's important to set an expectation, because we started looking at this problem and said, okay, how do we put something together that's that uses internet web technology to maybe assist with the problem? And we came to a realization. If we think about the level of trust that you need to close a deal like this, it's a very high bar. There's a lot that you need to have. You have to have all your ducks in a row. You've got to have your banks, your insurance, you got to have everything. But there's a threshold to go past, which is lower than that. And that's the threshold to say that the parties are willing to seriously explore the deal. And the question we've been asking is, can we put together the kind of web technology solution that would get farmers and buyers over that first threshold? Because if we get them over the first threshold, then the systems are already there, and something like VeriGrain could probably put another block on that stack to get us closer to completion, and TechMesh might get another block, and somewhere along the way we'd actually get to the top and we'd have a deal. We'd have all the pieces necessary for a deal to be realized and everybody to trust it. So that's the expectation of what we're trying to do, is to see what kind of web solution would allow us to meet the first bar, which is the level of trust to explore the deal in a serious way. Or to put it another way, we're really talking about a dating site. This just gets you decide whether you want to show up at the restaurant. So if you want to slip to the next slide. Is that? Yeah, I think we'd go one past that to the next. Yeah. Started to think about what are the pieces we need to have put in place. Now, clearly, we need a lot of information about the sources. So a gallery and detailed information about each of the farms or each of the groupings of farms, if they choose to work as a group. And the ability to store and make readily available all kinds of information, and all the protocols for the safety, and you don't want to show it to them, but you want to show it to someone else. All that stuff has to be in place. There's a whole lot of supporting information: library, government standards, NUDS, test methods, shipping standards, all kinds of supporting information for the process that needs to be close at hand. If it's not close at hand, then people won't feel comfortable going forward and we don't cross that boundary. A number of services. And then the hard part, we have to go find a gallery of buyers. We have to identify, in this case, looking at the Pacific Rim, we have to find the people in the Pacific Rim that would actually be interested in knowing about Canadian agricultural products, wheat, grain products, and their sources. And to do that, the good news is there probably aren't that many of them. We don't need to go and talk to the Japanese public. We need to find the purchasing manager of that large Japanese brewery. So it's a very targeted audience, but if you could get them aware that they could go to a gallery and see the details of Canadian products for those who wish to make their products available as a branded specific product, then we have the basis of pulling this together. And if we can provide enough additional information, we have the information to get them over that first bar. Then it's up to them to close the deal, to decide how they want to do it. And the goal, ideally, long term, is this is the kind of business that should be a relationship business. It's not a spot. There is a spot market already, but this becomes valuable if it's a relationship. If it's a kind of thing where they're getting the same product on a regular basis every month, every year, every quarter, whatever, they're getting shipments and they come in reliably and they know where they're coming from and they've got exactly what they're going to use it for. Those are the kinds of things that give long-term stability and, generally speaking, a significantly premium price. And that's really what we're trying to do. So if we go to the next slide, things actually have gotten a little bit complicated right at the moment. The model is that we would use social media and local representatives. And this is something I've done a lot in the past, is hire people virtually, locally, all over the world. It's a question of setting them up, training them, giving them the tools, giving them the information, and having them go out and put the story in front of the potential buyers. Now, if you've noticed that the story about how you do that with social media has gotten a little complicated in the last couple of months. We would have just said Twitter before. Well, there's a few little things that have gotten confused at the moment. So there's some careful thinking going on right now. But nonetheless, the basic process is to do this in the easiest, fastest, lowest cost method possible, which is to use local social media to reach out and do informational education. We're not trying to sell. It isn't ours to sell, but it's ours to create the conditions where foreign buyers are fully aware of the differentiated product that's available in the Canadian marketplace. You want to add anything to that, Adil?
No, I think we covered the vast territory, and maybe Barry can.
If there are questions,
can take it from there.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. That was excellent. And if I could get you to stop sharing your screen, and we'll bring back the other panel members as well. There we are. Great. Again, this has the potential to be as disruptive as I guess the atmospheric river or whatever else, but in a different way. Certainly, you're presenting a challenge to the existing system of the bulk grain trade, and it looks like the pieces are all here. And certainly, one of the things that Ken mentioned about the smartphone, and I guess the notion of the internet being more broadly available as well, will certainly add to that possibilities. The one thing I will feel though is, every time I have to deal with a new piece of software, maybe it's my age, but I get this panic attack that, oh my God, I'll never understand it. And I'm sure that for a lot of producers, that must be a feeling of apprehension as well. And maybe I'll direct this first to Ken, because you've been dealing directly with producers on this. What sort of resistance do you get to this idea of just, like, is this brand new and getting people to try something new?
Growers in general are quite adept with, they live their lives on their phone, for a lot of it. So and they've been exposed to a lot of, I should say, they've been bombarded by technology for 20 years now, and I often hear that especially when it comes to in the field, they're drowning in data, and they need actionable information, and so a big driver for us, and I feel your pain, Barry, and I like to think that the fact that I'm 60 plus, and I lead our app development and engineering team, and I like to be blunt about the fact, if I can figure it out, then it's probably okay, because I have zero patience for figuring things out, and so yeah, we're constantly looking for ways to make the sort of access and understanding of the technology easier, and the tools are there, but the challenge is to and again, maybe I'm my own worst enemy, because I have, I'm an engineer, I developed a lot of products, I tend to sort of love to shoot for the, why would you just put a balloon in the air when you can maybe get to the moon? And so I that's always a bit of a reality check on with product development, and like I say, a never-ending challenge, and especially when you've got, we have our team of app developers. I think the average age is well under 30. So these guys are like, they've lived with it their whole lives, and and actually at the one point, in fact, I want to say right now, none of our developers grew up on a farm. So I've actually made a point of taking them to a farm and showing them, this is what it looks like out here, guys. And I probably need to do that again, but yeah, it's a never-ending challenge.
Can I direct a question to Ken?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, Ken, one of the things we're thinking about is that there's the technical part of it, which is really just finding the right integration. That's actually not terrible. It's a very moving target at the moment, but it's not technically difficult.
Mm-hmm.
The hard part in the very front end is, well, in my mind, is going to be the story, the content. For a farm to put their best foot forward, they're going to have to sell themselves. They're going to have to explain themselves. That's going to be in English and pictures and stuff like that. So we're actually thinking of a model where we have a fair bit of white glove care at the upfront side. I mean, it doesn't have to be massive, because it'll be well structured. If it's a well structured thing, you basically put things in the slot. But if you have someone who helps you do that, so I guess my question is, I was pretty certain the farmers on the technical side would be strong. Do you think they need the upfront white glove help on the content, the storytelling?
Well, yeah, without question. I mean, I've sort of, let me turn around my hat, and then I'll put my marketing label out front. Yeah, there's I often joke about the fact there's a reason that, farmers are referred to a lot as producers and growers. I've never heard a farmer referred to as a marketer. And ultimately, and what you're talking about is that sort of the old sizzle versus steak, and absolutely, if you could come up with a framework, and I would be actually.
Well, if it's a commodity, then all of the technical specification numbers are the driving factor. If it's a brand,
Yeah.
then you really have to make that farm seem like it's special.
Yes.
And I don't think it takes a lot of person hours to do that, but you're gonna have to put some in there. And our sense was that was probably a critical piece of the service that would be required to get the farm presented and presentable in a way that would make it live up to its potential.
Another question has come in, and the question is there an opportunity to layer transportation system data, rail, vessel, terminal, port, truck data, on top of this kind of a buy-sell portal? It seems that all have a lot of related data, but nowhere to view it in one contiguous view.
Well, Chris is going to handle it all.
We track it all across the supply chain. I was just going to say, even on the farmer telling the story side, we're launching a consumer portal that basically allows farmers to tell their own story with video and data about their products. So yeah, we'll be here to capture all that information. I think it is important to get the full supply chain in place. And, Adil and I have had this conversation about, how do you make sure that you've got that view? I love this combination of companies on this call, because we've got the very much front end of the grain process, and we've got the grain marketing side with the grain portal, but you do need that kind of end-to-end supply chain view to make sure that you've got the transportation details, particularly now with sustainability coming into play. Anybody selling into the EU needs the deforestation certification. So yeah, we're happy to be that middle of the supply chain stuff to pick up all those data points.
I certainly recall when I first was looking at the containerization of grain, it occurred to me that the two critical issues that had to be dealt with was dealing with trust, essentially. One is that if there was a discrepancy between the quality, how would that be dealt with? And the second one was, how do the farmers guarantee to get paid? So to some degree, it seems like this system has those two sort of handled. There obviously are other few details like plastic liners and containers, and there's some physical aspects of moving grain around that can't be ignored. We still have to deal with the real product as well as just the information and the payment. Adil, you might want to comment on that, or not.
Sorry, I was on mute. Sorry. I started my sentence, but didn't go anywhere. Well, very much so. I think on farmers' mind, first and foremost is what they're going to get at farm gate and how they're going to get paid. And our sort of cardinal rule we adopted for our trade facilitation efforts is that it's cash payment before grain possession changes hands. It doesn't have to go beyond that. In terms of payments, I think various alternatives will emerge. And the thing to keep in mind in this regard is that no serious grain buyer from overseas is going to be satisfied with the volume that they can collect from one farm or even 5 farms or even 10 farms. So consolidation is going to be a key aspect of this containerization challenge. And we see a huge territory there for new types of service providers to emerge to bridge that gap. And it's amazing that we're now thinking about structuring a partner program. I mean, neither Ken or Chris have heard from us in this regard, because we just take it for granted that, we fit together. We all need each other. But beyond that, consolidation and just cleaning and bagging and, the logistics of getting the grain into the container, and needless to say, getting that container to the end market. So there are a lot of parts to this that will sort themselves out. And the approach that we had taken was to start with a number of key strategic pilot projects. One was on canola, one was on specialty wheats, and the third one on malting barley. And we were hoping that all these elements would fall into place as we got into the process of fulfilling a steady contract. And the contracts were like 1,000 tons a month of each. So the flow was there. But unfortunately, given my 10, 15 years in China, most of my buyer contacts are in that particular land. And now it's not a matter of whether this month or next month, there's a definite moratorium coming from China on grain imports from Canada. We brought this upon ourselves, and in the aggregate, we're still talking about Ukraine, Russia, this, that. This is where 1/5 of our exports go on average. Some years less, some years more. This is going to deliver a huge blow to our grain economy. And we sort of assumed a few weeks ago this was a fait accompli and moratorium was on its way. It was a matter of when it was going to be delivered. So we're now, we were paying attention to Korean and Japanese and Indonesian markets as well, but it's going to delay these pilot projects a few months, I think.
If I could stop you there, because I'd like to get to another question. Because I appreciate what you're saying, and maybe Vietnam.
No, I was finished.
Another one of those. Okay. There's also a comment came through in the chat that a source to move the container project forward is there, and there's a website you might want to check out. One of the questions that came, and it is an interesting one because down to the business model really is where is the revenue stream obtained? I can understand VeriGrain, you're selling a product and that is your revenue stream, but in terms of the blockchain and the grain portal, how do you finance yourself?
Well, for TheoryMesh, we're a commercial software provider. So we, our primary target market right now is food processors. And because we help them handle food safety, food tracking, traceability within their own operations, we typically help them save money, which more than offsets the cost of the software. And then as we connect them back in their supply chain, there's an opportunity for them to sell their product at a higher value. So we see, sustainability in some circles commanding a 20% premium on products as they're going through that supply chain. So today we're very much a software company, and we sell into the customers that we work with.
Okay, thank you. The grain portal, how do you finance yourselves? Do you take a position or a percentage, or how does it work?
Well, firstly, we have some user fee sources, both producers and in time buyers, and obviously we're going to lean heavier on the buyer side than the producer side. But right now we're going into the monetization phase next month. With our latest version of the portal, subscription fees and 40, 50 articles we've published. We have different ways of monetizing that stream, and how all other information portals monetize themselves as well, advertising revenues and so on. And we have a plan in that regard. But in the long run, we really are going to be a fee-for-service platform because I mentioned the consolidation challenge. I mean, that's not going to happen naturally. And servicing, as well as containerization and container supply. I mean, these are going to be challenges. So we really do not see a huge challenge more than paying for our services and developing however fancy Vic decides to make the platform, the costs of it through fulfillment fees and consolidation fees. Somebody's going to say,
it's an interesting kind of platform because there are some monetization possibilities. I mean, it's more a case of several different kinds of monetization that adds up. But I'll give you an example. It would be nice if you were a farmer or a group of farmers looking at a foreign buyer if they had a blue check mark.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, and if that means that somebody has gone to the trouble of actually checking that their email is correct, that the company exists, et cetera, that's part of the trust building that's required. And the same thing works exactly the other way.
Well, again,
so there are there's definitely some value added pieces that I think are probably essential to creating the marketplace anyway. I mean, it's not a case of, these are not cosmetic. These are necessary parts of the arrangement.
Well, again, if you can return a value to the seller and the buyer, there's room always for an intermediary.
Yeah.
That's the way business works. I have one last question for you, Chris, which dealt with the IEEE blockchain and agriculture working group. Could you give us a few minutes or a minute on just what that's about?
Yeah. So the IEEE is one of the international standards bodies that looks at how to create portable standards for different technologies. So Ethernet, Wi-Fi, all of those things were developed through IEEE standards. Back in 2019, the IEEE started a working group on blockchain for agriculture based on kind of seeing the trend towards looking at more and more interest from countries into this traceability idea, these concepts. So it's been a working group that's been established for quite some time. It's multinational representation. So I'm the Canadian person on the on the group. We got China, a few different countries in Europe, Africa, and Australia in the mix. And really, the group is there to look at the standards that can be adopted in the agriculture space. And where it has started is to look at some of the more technical standards. So what are the pieces of other working groups' efforts that need to be adopted for agriculture? But now the group is moving into thinking about data portability standards and actual standards around information exchange to be able to have things that go across border. So as Vic and Adil are looking at exchanging information between buyers and sellers, there will be some international standards that come up for blockchain-based transactions in agriculture. So we're going to see more sort of global standardization happen over time in this space, which should open the door for some of those trading partners to be able to do things in a more digital way.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to all the panel. I realize that we're about 20 minutes over time, and thank you to the audience for staying with us. We do appreciate that. And, as I look at today, I'm reminded of that old Chinese curse about living in interesting times. And we certainly do live in interesting times. And I think we've seen that with the many presentations today. But interesting times also create opportunities for change and opportunities for improvement. And I think this last panel really dealt with how we might be able to see a different future coming about in some ways, perhaps because of the challenges that we face, that where people are open to new things, just like we're now doing a webinar instead of a meeting in person. I guess I would say that there's very few countries that are better positioned than Canada to ride out whatever comes ahead. We do have a solid agricultural base and a really good transportation logistics system. And we have talented people. And we're at the forefront. We are lucky to be in this developed country with new technology, even if an old guy like me is a little hard pressed to adopt it always. Fortunately, the younger generation isn't, and they're ready to move forward. So I'd like to thank all of the presenters and the chairs for your kind time today to be with us. I'd also like to very much thank our sponsors. We didn't get enough time to really display them, but this recording is being made and we will have the sponsors displayed at the end of each of the sessions. So we do appreciate very much their contribution, because without that, we wouldn't be able to provide this as a free webinar. I would like to point out that there were 220 people registered. Maybe not everybody stayed for the whole session, but 220 people is certainly a broad representation across the country, and we very much appreciate those who did come in. And finally, I'd like to thank my colleagues in the Asper School of Business and the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences, who did a lot of the background work to make sure that this happened. The advertising of it, the development of the program, the website, and all the details that go into making such an event possible. And finally, to our AV master, Chris, who kept us all on track here and kept things going. So with that, I would like to thank everybody again for coming to the 27th annual Fields on Wheels. I hope that you're able to join us next year, because I'm sure we're going to have a 28th. So with that, I'll say thank you very much. And I guess it's not too early to say Merry Christmas to all as well. So bye for now, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Barry.
Bye.